All right. Is that visible? Okay. I hope everybody online also sees this. All right. So this is the topic of today is the topic of the first week. After the introduction, we said we're going to talk about prices. Okay. So let's start. The way we're going to proceed is start a bit from what I consider common sense evidence. If you don't, that is, if you think that what for me is common sense evidence is not common sense evidence for you, interrupt and let me know. And so let's consider at what we say when somebody says, oh, the price is X, 3 euros. For you, if you're the buyer, the price is the cost you pay to obtain something. Now, notice that this requires immediately a very particular circumstance. That is, that there is somebody in front of you, or maybe remotely via the web, that sells you something. That is, you are in a situation buyer-seller. Somehow the price has been agreed upon. It may be a posted price. You may have been bargaining. You may have made an offer suddenly to someone that didn't want to sell that beer they just bought, but you were so thirsty that you walked over to the guy and said, oh, I'll pay you 3 times what you just paid for that beer. May I have it? And the guy said, fine, here you go. Give you the beer. Anything, okay? But there is a buyer and a seller. Why am I saying that? As we will try to see in a moment, there are situations in which you think that something has a price, but there was no seller. And in some sense, there was no buyer either. It just happened. That camera was supposed to be working on Tuesday, didn't it? We tried to figure out what went on. Spent about 15 minutes, didn't solve it, had to start class. We started class. Bunch of emails among various people. It was unclear. Today we came 4 times to this classroom. It was always busy, so we couldn't check what was going on. We managed to get in at a certain point, but there was not enough time. The other professor wanted to teach. He was in a hurry. We had to leave. Carlo, the technician that just pulled the plug and pulled the plug, pulled the plug and pulled the plug a number of times until finally the plug said, okay, I feel like working. Had spent some time in between going to another class and trying to figure out what the system was. We came here at 5:15 and started working. So all in all, if you put all people together and getting it to work, and the work is okay, but it's okay, better than nothing, took a total, if you add up among people, maybe 3 hours time. That's quite a bit of time, right? We obtained something, it's working. Was there a price? Well, clearly there was a price, as I will try to convince you in a certain language. Okay, but it was hidden. It's not a monetary price. So keep that in mind. So the price, anyhow, go back to the situation when instead there is a simple situation buying and selling, which is the most frequent. It's the one for which we use the word price most often, means that what's a cost for you is whatever they receive in exchange of whatever they give you, okay? I'm quite sure that at this point you're already confused. Why? Because I put a bunch of things together. I introduced a situation that had nothing to do with the previous one. If I had not had the opportunity of using Carlo's experience, I would have used another one analogous to that. So I started talking about buying and selling between a buyer and the seller, and then I looked at the situation in which there was no buyer and no seller. I still said such a thing as a price, and the price of that is a cost for one. That's another economic word. Is a reward for those selling. So we have to try to put things together a bit and see if there is a way of thinking at this. okay? That's what we're going to try to do today. So we're going to go by steps. As I said, I'm going to use the historical approach, but I've also said I'm not going to follow a timeline. So we're going to see between today and Tuesday the way in which prices were analyzed, conceived, theorized by social scientists over a few different centuries. But we're not going to start from St. Thomas, as it's called, the Aquinato, okay, and tell us what he considered as a price, and then go all the way to Baudrillard or Canaro, maybe more relevant than me. But we're going to start from our common sense, see if there is a theory that fits to it, and then ask why is that some people have seen things differently. And is the way in which we theorize about prices correct? Does it make sense? Or is it biased? Is it a bit of a confusion or an ideology? Remember, we'll have to make an effort every time to check what's ideological in our statement, okay? And anyhow, so the steps are going to be this. Common sense economics. What's the price of something for the buyer? Common sense economic. What's the price of something for the seller? So we're going to talk about buyer and seller at the beginning. And then we're going to ask, what's the price of something for the lonely human? We'll have to talk a bit about this. As you will see, many people, not so many, but a number of people think that doing this exercise, the exercise of thinking at the lonely human, is ideological. It's not scientific. So we'll discuss that. We'll gather up the intuition for step 1 to 3 and say a price is both a reward and a cost. Then we'll look at the two separately and get to what I consider to be a conclusion. That the ultimate cost of something, which is also its price, is just determined by the willingness to pay of the last buyer. And there was no room left in the slide. I would have added, and the willingness to sell of the last seller. And we will see what this strange word means. We'll try to give it some precise meaning to last seller, last buyer, willingness to pay, willingness to sell. This is something I already mentioned, right? Is this ideology or is this a fact? The conclusion I will try to lead you to, because I believe it to be correct for what we understand about prices of current analysis, is that prices get determined by the meeting, by the matching of these two willingnesses. Somebody sells, somebody buys. Somebody's willing to pay a price, somebody's happy to receive a reward. Somebody's willing to afford a certain cost, somebody thinks that covers the value that the object of service has for them. But this is a relatively recent view. In fact, I would say as an established dominant view among people doing economics, it's probably a century old. Maybe a century and a half. It depends how you count. What would be you count the number of people agreeing with that. Okay, I would say probably a century ago, almost everybody doing economics was willing to agree with that. A century and a half ago, there was an even split. Before that, and for a long time, and we will talk a lot more about this on Tuesday. And this is because in this way you will have time to read some stuff during the weekend that I'll suggest you to read. For a long time, people that interrogated themselves about prices thought that there was the true price of things, the correct price, or in some variation, even the just price. They gave it very many names: the normal price, the long run price, the fair price, the true price, the just price. But roughly they were going around the same idea, that the ratio, that something had a certain worth, and that worth was objectively calculable in some form. But there was a way of reaching that anybody looking at an Apple or a PC or an hour of my teaching, well, in that case, in the hour of my teaching, it's very easy, it's zero. So everybody would agree on that, probably negative. But apart from an hour of my teaching, most people would say, oh, that's the fair price, that's the just price. If you remember, I mentioned the other day the story of usury, right? That is of receiving interest on loans. And one of the reasons why there was this widespread belief that you could not charge an interest was because there was a view that the true fair price of lending something was just nothing, it was zero. So there was a lot, but we'll look at that after doing our common sense economics. Okay, so we'll start today with a bit of common sense. This is a technique I will use also for the other concepts, because as I said, I don't think it's interesting to start saying, oh, Spanish monetarist of 1600 in Seville or Salamanca said such and such, and then some French guy said such and such. It's pretty boring. Also, because we like to always mention the same guys, so it's repetitive. So the price is that a word for something. Like, try to ask yourself. I don't know if you ever sold anything. If you sell a used car, maybe at your age, maybe you don't have a used car, a used bike, or a used. Anybody has ever traded on eBay, whatever, secondary market? No experience? Yes. So when you accept to sell your old cell phone, or in the United States, they're called sneakers, the sports shoes that everybody likes. How do you decide what the price is? It's a true question, so I'm happy to receive answers even from people online. Not all questions are rhetorical. Some are meant to be true questions. So try to work together. Why do you say, I don't know, you have an old pair of, I have an old pair of Air Jordan. Very old, very classical. When Jordan was still dunking the ball. I might have put them on twice, essentially new. I don't remember what they costed. They didn't cost a lot back then. Probably I could sell them for a few $100 these days. They're from a series that's, I'm sure it's out of production. In fact, if anybody's interested, I think I bought them in 1991 in Chicago. And I was a professor at Kellogg Graduate School of Management. Size 43, European, 10, very good condition. As I said, I wore them twice. Then I thought, Jesus, do I look like an idiot? And I put them on, I stored them away. So what would I accept? If you were in my position, I decided to put them on eBay. What would I accept as an offer? What would be the price? I need a JKJ class, okay? Movement. Right, but assume there is nobody. Well, if I refer to that guy and the guy says 100, would you go for 100 for sure? But good. It depends on what you want, right?
Right now, we sell it for 200 first, or even 300, and then later on we'll say, "Oh, I'm getting a discount of 100," so it's down to 200. And someone may say, "Okay, I take it for 200. You get it 200."
So good. The first thing you say is, "It's up to me, and it will depend on circumstances." There is no true price on my shoes. Anybody agrees? I need somebody to contradict me. Extra points. Well, extra beers. If I like the class, typically I have a tradition since I started teaching at Chicago back in 1986, which is I take the class out for beers at the end of the course, but before the exam, otherwise they hate me after the exam. So it's not good to have beers that people hate you. So you take them out for beer in between. end of class and exam. So I need reaction. So everybody agrees with their theory that I don't really know. Might be somebody that ask 100. If I really am in a hurry and need that money, so I'm not selling the shoes just because, but because I need the money, then I may say 99.99 and try to sell it before him or her. And if not, in other circumstances, if I'm not in a hurry, I may ask 300 and then pretend I'm lowering the price. Sale, discount, 33%, 200. And then somebody picks it and I get 200. You had your hand up. Eh? Right, that's what your friend was saying. She said somebody else is selling the same thing at 100. But say there are comparable shoes on the market. If I say my friend Larry Jones was my colleague at the time, I bet Larry bought a pair of shoes. He might have worn them more than me, he likes sneakers. But say he had a second pair he never used. So it's same condition as mine. He also puts it on. I call Larry. I say, Larry, I'm selling my Jordan. Oh, I'm selling my Jordan too. Then we both put them on the market. Do you what do you think is going to happen? Yeah, and we may decide to compete. You see, everything becomes immediately very complicated, right? We may decide to compete. We may even decide to collude. We may exchange information about how many people we think are trying to sell them. We might even, I don't know if eBay allows us, but being too nasty, theoretical economists and knowing about bid and ask and oral auction, double, single auctions in general, we might say, oh, let's auction them out. You know what an auction is? In Italian, it's called asta. Okay? Which means we might say, we will sell these shoes using the method of, have you ever heard about auctions? Anybody's heard about auctions here? No. Huh? They allow. eBay allows. Good, right? So, I don't know, second best offer, right? For example, or other things. So all of this will become immediately very complicated. Let's not go that way. Let's go back for a moment. As you see, immediately it's become very complicated to decide what the price is. But let's go back for a moment, it's just me. And maybe there is somebody else that I don't know, anonymous, that has put a similar price at 100. Still our considerations apply to even this simple case. I have to think, do I need the money? How fast do I need it? Do I really want it? Am I doing it only for fun? Or might even say, this is very emotional to me. I bought it because my son, this is a true story, said, I want to buy, and he gave it to his son. My son at the time was 7. And he said, he saw some small Jordan shoes for a toddler, for a 2-year-old, 2.5, maybe 3. And he said, Daddy, can we buy those? I said, why do you want to buy those? You can't wear those. He says, oh, but they are the original Air Jordan for a 3-year-old. I said, yeah, it's all, you're 7. He says, yeah, but I will have a child one day. And at that time, Mike will not be playing. And I want him to know who Mike Jordan was. And I want to give him the shoes. It's true. He bought the shoes and then he gave it to his son. The son could wear them. So we bought those too. So there's a lot of sentimental value attached. I might decide that I sell it, but only if I get an extraordinary offer that compensates for the sentimental value. Or maybe it's just because it reminds me that at the time I was 35 and now I'm 65. And that's a bit of a different age. Okay. So you see, what's the point? Can somebody help me to see what the point is of all this blah, blah, blah about Air Jordan?
Well, just wonder, just the fact that you have this emotional value attached to a price, and that you maybe sell it for a price that values with respect to circumstance, doesn't necessarily mean that you can construct true price. What if you could? Because if you look at 3 grams of gold and 2 grams of gold, 3 grams.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're all wearing silly things. Speak up, otherwise.
So why? Let's say you could take away this emotional aspect of how much somebody values something. Why couldn't you compare technically how much something's worth of something else. You can say that 3 grams of gold are more valuable than 2, irrespective of emotion. Why don't you translate that to all?
Good point. So, well, his observation is some goods, say that instead of having my shoes, for which there is a particular value, I was trying to sell 3 grams of gold. Standard just gold, no crafted in a jewel, nothing, just gold, a little bowl of gold. He says, well, that has an objective price. Just open up the Wall Street Journal, say, or you go online where some trading thing and tells you what the price of gold is in that moment. Right? So that's another way of determining prices. We'll see to that because that's in some sense the opposite extreme of my shoes. But the point is that we have to find a definition of price that fits both. The case of the 3 grams of gold and the Air Jordan from 1991.
Yeah, I don't think so. Even if we can quantify, aren't we supposed to all agree as human beings that gold is valuable? Because maybe in this culture, gold is valuable, but to someone else, gold is not. So even scarcity, because if somebody else don't use money at all, they just equate everything into food, they don't have anything to eat gold because gold is not edible.
It's very valuable.
We don't know. That's good. You're both, you don't have to disagree because you're both saying the same things. Now, what's the common thing of what you're saying? In fact, we don't need all of humanity to agree that something is valuable. Maybe water is the only thing that humanity seems to share. Air too, oxygen seems also to be useful to everybody. For something to have a price, all I need is that one person, as I will try to convince you, think it's valuable. And certainly 2 is enough. The thing that comes out from your conversation is it depends a lot of circumstances. In fact, it depends even on cultural aspects. In some culture, jade is very valuable. In some other, it's a lot less valuable. The Emperor of China thought ivory was extremely valuable back then. I don't know what Xi Jinping thinks right now about ivory. We'll have to ask. So part of the value of something or price at which people are willing to trade seem to depend on personal circumstances. So let's try to capture what's common in this observation. What common is certainly there is willingness to pay. Remember the reward, right? Or sell, sorry, the reward. And second, it depends a lot on the personal circumstances of the people that are selling. Does this apply also to the case of gold? Yes, it does apply to the case of gold. Why? Because the organized market for gold is made up of a bunch of people, firms, traders, all kinds of people, from very big speculators in gold to very small speculators in gold. Okay? And that the fact that they trade gold for the profit or they trade gold because they need gold for their production makes no difference. The point is that those of them that owns gold or think that they have a legal way of pretending that they own gold, let's not get complicated. I'm not talking about futures, just pretend it's a spot market for delivery of gold, okay? Otherwise, we're gonna get too sophisticated, and those that don't have taken classes in other courses may get all confused. It's just a market where you want the gold, I'll give you the gold, really. Oh, here it is, I have it in the palm, okay? It's still the case that those that sell the gold have to be feeling rewarded by what they receive. So the price at which something is traded has to be perceived as a reward by the seller. High enough. And the point is that this reward is very subjective. the fact that there is at a certain point a common price at which all gold is traded in this moment does not imply that everybody that owns gold would be willing to trade at that price. It means that some people in that moment are willing to trade at that price, and some other are not. Right? Otherwise, we would see all gold exchanging hands at that price, which does not happen. Where am I going? Well, I'm going to those words in red. Now, those words in red are seen by people as very important by some economists and are seen as very ideological by others. What is it they say? Utility theory, subjectivism, objectivism, comparable utilities, ordinal utilities, cardinal utilities. It's a bunch of words. They point to what? They point to a tentative of formalizing this observation that from the point of view of the seller or the buyer, there is a reward component in the price. The buyer has to feel rewarded, meaning it must feel that it's worth it to pay that price. And we have not yet said what the price is made of. Could be a pound of flesh, could be some gold, could be some dollars, some euros, some lire, okay? Pay the price. That is giving up something valuable to her, receiving something that has to be at least as valuable, if not more. Now, when people say, oh, you're assuming people are rational and do calculations and they're all free to do things. No, I'm not. I'm not assuming they're rational, that they're doing perfect calculation or anything. I'm perfectly aware that when I'm drunk, and I've been drunk in the far past, obviously, very seldom, but when I'm drunk, I'm willing to perceive that the reward of an extra gin and tonic is particularly high, even if I'm in a very fancy hotel and they ask me $20 for that stupid gin and tonic. All right? And that one said, that was not very rational, Michele. Sure, I'm not sure rationally rational what it means. Point is that to the extent that you don't lock me up because I've become unable to have free will and I need to be put under restrictions, I am feeling that I'm being rewarded by the gin and tonic at a value equal or higher than what $20 are. I may not have calculated it. I may not have the same opinion tomorrow morning when I wake up and I'm sober, all kind of things. Okay, I took an extreme situation, obviously, but it's still the whims of the moment, which confirms the fact that there is a huge subjective component in prices. As you will see, there's also an objective component. So it's hard to say, oh, I have a perfect theory and it's just that. No, that's what makes it interesting. It's the complication. But certainly there is a willingness to pay. The way in which economists, since the middle of the 19th century, so roughly, since let's put 1850, just to give a date. 1860 is more appropriate because I think 1860 check is when Gibbons and Menger published their work on which they introduced the word utility and happiness and so on. I think it was 1860, but doesn't matter. They must have been thinking also about that before publishing, right? So let's put 1850. In 1850, they were having dinner and thinking about it. People started to introduce this view. There is a willingness to pay that is reflected in the price. It's certainly when something is priced. And notice that when we mean price, we mean that there is the actual exchange. We don't mean that there is something in the Spanish comes to me. What's the name of the escaparate in Italian. Vetrina, in the window of the shop, right? You put up something showing because you want to sell it, you put a price. Well, it's priced. That's not really its price. If you ever, for example, try to buy some jewel, if you buy jewels that are, say, more, even cheap jewel. It just happened to me, bought something very extremely cheap on the street in Lecce. That was an asking price, but then I said, oh, I'll give you X. And I said, oh, give me X plus €1. I said, okay, fine. That was the price. The price of that object was the one at which he said, fine, right? And I said, fine, and I'll give him the money, and he gave me the object, which was different from the price he had posted. So pricing really means the actual thing you pay. Okay, keep it in mind. You can ask all the price you want, as long as you don't sell and somebody has said, that's not a price. That's just a dream. Tentative. Okay? So the point that this utility theory tries to capture is the idea that to the extent that exchange is voluntary, there has to be a willingness to pay and a willingness to accept the pay. And that this is subjective. It reflects the subjective situation of the individual. The individual may be in need of money desperately. Then his willingness to accept a low price is higher. The individual may not be in need for money, and then his willingness to accept is much more limited. The individual may have to cover, as we will see in a moment, the cost of the thing. Absolutely, because if it doesn't cover the cost, doesn't get the cash to reimburse the bank, and it's the Far West, and if the bank doesn't get the payment back, they'll send out some killers and kill you. Making it up. Okay? Something like that. They pull all your credit and you go bankrupt. So there's a lot of circumstances that are economic, some of them, or psychological. That's why I picked up the example of the shoes. It would be a purely psychological, emotional, or the example of the gin and tonic when you're drunk. That's also emotional and psychological interpretation that determines your willingness to pay. But it plays a role. Now, is that all that there is to prices? No. But one claim I like to make, and I'll stop here for a moment, I pause for a moment, and I see what you have to say, of people that are listening, if they have to say. I make the claim that the subjective component, that we, the economists, model by saying utility, is a key aspect of the ocean. That there is a subjective value that comes into place. And as I promised, I stop for a moment. Stop for a moment in the sense that I'm waiting for criticism, things like that. Prego. Please. You know, what I would like to do is to see if there is a, let me try something. This is supposed to be a microphone. Now, because if I do this, how long are you? I'm not sure I have to try.
When we model the utility, the assumption is we have this in you. When somebody gives me two things, I don't know what I prefer. Isn't it the case that the price of something changes my willingness to pay? So if you see the Jordans and you don't like them, you don't know anything about them, you will maybe be willing to pay very little. If you see the price and their perceived value immediately jumps up. Here's something. So
that's, I don't know. Could be, could not be. That's something that neuroscientists have been looking at, and there are that's what I would call an advanced topic. Why? So your friend said, by the way, everybody hears me, not just in class, those online. if somebody online, let me check. Writing, if you don't hear me with this new technique, because I moved one of the microphone toward the class, so the question that are being asked may be recorded, and I'm using a different microphone. So if you don't hear, just write something, okay? Hey, somebody wrote something. We hear you perfectly. Very good. Happy to hear that. It's all a hearing thing. Okay. All right. So I'm not sure if that the people understood what your colleague here said. So let me repeat it. He said, isn't it true that if the person looking at the Jordan shoes knows about the Jordan shoes, he may have their own value of the Jordan shoes. But if the person doesn't know the Jordan shoes at all, and therefore has no idea what they might be worth, once they see that the price is high, they may change their evaluation by noticing that the price is high. People have theorized that, and it may be true that in some circumstances that is the case. And my answer was, well, that's an advanced topic. Why? Well, because it introduces an angle which is very important to research in economic theory, especially today, but it's been for at least half a century, which is what we call symmetry of information. So when I'm selling the Jordan shoes, I'm selling the Jordan shoes. I have some information about that. Notice that part of the information is potentially public and common. That is, there was a guy called Michael Jordan, still alive, by the way. Used to play basketball, did certain kind of things, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Nike was the sponsor. Nike thought that the Jordan shoes was very good. Deal, never found a good one like that since. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's all public information to a certain extent. If you invest enough time these days on the web, in the old days, if you invest enough time talking to people and reading newspaper, you could figure that out, even 30 years ago. But the value, the subjective value for Michele Boldrin, that's strictly private information. No way, unless I tell you, and I do a really truth-telling operation, another thing that we've been studying a lot, but it's not part of the foundation. I might communicate the subjective value. In fact, a cynic economist could say, well, there is a simple way you communicate how much it's valuable for you, the subjective part. Just name a price. Just give you a reservation price. What we call the reservation price is the price at which I am willing to sell. I'm selling at that price or anything higher than that. Lower than that, I say no, right? In some sense, I can give you the whole story, the one I said before, and Niccolo and this and that, and even add more details about to be like Mike and all that stuff. And you can try to gather from that how much I value the shoes, or I can just say 250. And as far as you're concerned, and the economic transaction between you and I are concerned, that's all you need to know. Meaning it contains information. But that's an advanced topic, and this is called the foundation of the advanced foundation. So we'll take that observation that says the character in front of you is trying to gather some information about what is the value of the thing for you. And the fact that you price it high contains some information that this person will have to try to exploit. But as I said, that will take us beyond what we're trying to do right now. But that's a good point. Okay? So, but it's a good point that reinforces the fact that there is a subjective aspect on both sides, buyer and seller, and that there is some information to be extracted, which is essentially the willingness, as far as economics is concerned. One can say, oh, you see, by you're mercifying everything, even your emotion, the history of your life, your relation with your son, your passion for Michael Jordan, just reducing it to the trade of shoes. He said, no, it just happened that I have the shoes and I may decide to sell them or not. Then the emotion and the story and the passion that remains independently from selling them or not. Maybe I'm selling them just because they make me so unhappy every time I see them. They remind me of my youth, that I'm trying to solve a psychological problem by selling the shoes. Who knows? It doesn't matter. That's neither here nor there. The thing I was trying to suggest is that this whole apparatus, this whole common sense observation that we're being piling up, point to the fact that in the decision process of individual, which need not be rational. In what sense? Well, we'll see at the end of the class some notes about that. You understand why I stopped? What does it mean to say that my calculation to sell the shoes has to be, or to buy the shoes has to be rational? Right, but you see, think about it. Consider the case of my sixth gin tonic that night. Right? It's not even possible to define it. So consider the case of the fifth gin and tonic. Sixth means give you the impression of an alcohol. So fifth is a bit within more reasonable bound. We had a great night. We were stopped at the restaurant after dinner, had a cup of gin and tonic, but then we felt like chatting, walked over. That's when I was your age, I would like to go to the Zattere. If it was summer or hot enough, we would tend to go a specific bar, but they don't sponsor me, so I will not mention it. No reason to advertise for free. You see what a silly bastard I am. And we would sit, and if the conversation was good, the gin and tonic, as far as I'm concerned, would come. For other people, other things would come. So when I ordered the fifth, what does it mean to be rational? I mean, what is that I consider? Well, let's say I certainly consider, okay, I'm staying at such and such an apartment in town tonight, so I don't have to drive. Good. Chances that I end up in a canal are low. Good. I am not a big swimmer and there are rats, but it's okay. My friends will not push me over. They're as drunk as I am, so I may have to, those may be consideration taking my mind. And probably you do that. One could say, and this is all stuff economists have been thinking about, in case you're curious, this is stuff we've been debating in the last year. Tomorrow, when you wake up, you will regret. There is a whole literature that comes from psychology about regret. Yourself today is not yourself tomorrow. What you're doing due to drunkenness is undervalue, underestimate the welfare of Michele tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. when he wakes up. And because you're not evaluating properly the utility of Michele, because it's 1 a.m. and you feel so good, right? You're doing something irrational. Could be. Point is that my only remark or intention in suspending my words on rational was we will have to work very hard eventually to decide what the hell rational means. Because in the specific context that I described, it's not clear what it means. Given that I have assumed, and that's not a very hard assumption, difficult assumption, that my decision to sell the Jordans or my decision to buy the gin and tonic or your decision to have an extra slice of pizza, even if you thought, had enough and I'm going to be sleepy at the 2 p.m. class, were not based on a strict calculation, but also on an emotional component, on a kind of instinctive, physical, emotional, psychological, call it as you want, sentimental component. And then the question is, what's the rational analysis of my emotion of I feel good with my friends? Okay, keep that in mind. So there's a lot of debate. I have slides exactly at the end. If you remember, I had them at the end of the other class. I have them at the end of this class too. They're not at the end, so they're in the middle because I want to go for that. We'll go to that, about this rationality. And I'm not pushing anything about rationality. I'm just saying, clearly, in paying the price or in accepting the price, there is a subjective component that may have to do with emotions. Instinct. I'm hungry. I want that slice. Now, let me give you a little bit of notions. Economists have been debating about this for a long time. They tend to agree now that, keep those words in mind and let's move on, that people have some preference ordering in their head. Meaning what? That even if they're changing over time, even if they might be mutable, and certainly they're subjective, individuals tend to have well-defined ordering of preferences in their mind when they make choices. They might be incomplete, they may be partial, they may be changing over time, as I repeat, and circumstances, but they're there. Neuroscientists have been studying this for a long time. And especially in recent years, they've made quite a bit of advances. There are two names and two links under the name there. If you're interested, this goes beyond the foundations of economics. Those are two friends and happens also to be two Italians. One is Aldo Rusticchini, so that leads you to Aldo's page on neuroeconomics on his website. And the other is Camillo Padova-Schioppa. Aldo is in Minnesota. We have been co-author and friends, but we're writing together. And let me say, you should buy the book. We'll publish in spring next year on some stuff, our first book in Italian. And Camillo Padova-Schioppa is a neuroscientist. He's at the medical school at WashU and also the economics department at WashU. And they both study this problem. Camillo in particular. Camillo has asked himself experimentally, is there a way in which I can classify the preferences that animals, monkeys in particular, reveal in an experimental setting as cardinal or ordinal? Everybody knows here what cardinal means and what ordinal means, or you want to go through it a bit? Say it. Yes, no. Yes or no? All right, good. No. Cardinal means that cardinal is what Camillo thought. So let me give you the example. The way he did it was to measure electric activity. It's a rough explanation, but you go to his website, you find a more detail and with a lot of pictures of the brain, graphs and figures, very nice. He essentially presented his monkeys with choices of goods. Goods, the monkeys, fruits, stuff like that. And measure with electrodes the electric activity in the brain in areas where it's known the reward system is getting active. Again, to understand better, you can check on Wikipedia, reward system. There's a huge literature, neuroscience on that, okay? And the thing he observed was the following, basically, very brutally, that the impulse associated to, say, a banana and the intensity of that impulse and its decay rate was independent from the fact that the alternative to the banana was an apple or a slap on the hand. What that means is that as far as the reward system is concerned, as far as our ability of measuring the intensity of the reward, the psychological reward, in fact, it's a kind of, there is a name, now my brain is forgetting the name. It's a provisional reward because the emotion you prove in getting the banana is not the emotion you prove in eating the banana. You're forecasting, in some sense, you're visually eating the banana. So if that's utility, that's certainly whatever you feel when you make the choice, you're grabbing the banana instead of the apple, that utility you feel, happiness you feel, doesn't depend from the alternative. So in that sense, it's cardinal, because as far as you're concerned, it's what it is. If it were ordinal, it would depend from what the alternative is. The idea of an ordinal system is a system that is able to say first, second, third, fourth, fifth, but it's not able to say this is worth that much, this is worth that much, this is worth that much. How much it is worth in terms of emotion was calculated somehow later. Okay, but as a cardinal system, there's been a big debate among economists for this. Why? Because in the days in which this idea of humans having some kind of preferences and pursuing their utility, making these choices in determining when it's case to sell or buy, there were also days in which people started to think about policies are the initial days of what you could call labor movement, Fabianism, and so on, or the idea of using social science to reform society and making it better. Okay, let's forget if we agree with that or not, doesn't matter. And so one of the big issues that came up from the very beginning was, should I take some money from her and give it to you, or vice versa? And the question was, why is that just? You're making her suffer and you're making him rejoice. Can you compare the two? It's an unsolved question, so we'll not debate it further in this class. And I personally think it's completely unsolvable, even logically, but it's a question of comparable utilities. Can I compare my suffering to your happiness and vice versa? Right? If you are a social reformer and wants to forcefully do any kind of transfer or imposition or order or whatever, in order to claim that this is good, it must be that you claim that in some sense, the sum total of the two utilities, between the giver and the receiver, goes up after your action, right? And this requires some form of cardinality. But it requires a lot more, but again, remember, it's a foundation class, okay? If utility is ordinal, no way. You cannot even start, okay? So that's why the issue was very much debated. It's not important for us to understand prices, but it's good you know that's what it was, okay? So that's one angle of prices. Oh, yeah, here it is finally. So rationality versus irrationality. As I said, yeah, this is a very fashionable topic. I kind of intentionally left it out of the course. It's not one of the 7 words I am treating, but I think I have to say a few words about it, particularly because I hope that a byproduct of the course is that this is a false problem. And whenever it's very fashionable, especially journalists, politicians, and people that think have strong opinion, know how to save the world, they always talk about that. And the world has become very simple. There are those that say, oh man, humans are irrational, hence they need me to tell them what to do. And the other that says, humans are rational and they agree with me, so they need just me to tell them what to do. Well, I think it's just a silly, false dichotomy. Why? Because humans are both rational or irrational and everything in between. And in fact, if you look at carefully at neurosciences, you realize that that's exactly what we're learning. It's not a 0-1. Okay? It's a continuum. And it's not even a continuum on one dimension between 0 and 1. It's a multidimensional continuum, and we haven't even counted the dimension. Now, this is something the neurosciences have understood. But I have to say that over the history of economics, even of old economics, people spoke on that thing. And I feel like I have to say a few words in defense and in honor of economists and social scientists that understood that the dichotomy rational-irrational is just silly. and understood it for a long time. Obviously, what most of them did was the preferences non disputando questo. The attitude of the typical economic theorists until functional MRI and brain scanning and experiment became available, but that was only 30 years ago, was, look, humans have preferences. They're very complicated, very subjective, and often very personal and emotionally induced. I'm not going to debate about it. I take them as they are. They're neither rational nor irrational. They're clearly what motivates us to live. On this, I have to recommend the work. It has become very repetitive and very boring. Like everybody that becomes famous for one idea, one big idea, and don't have a second, unfortunately, they go on repeating that idea up to nauseam. But if you're interested, go read the old books, not the recent ones. The recent one of somebody called Anthony Damasio. He's a neuroscientist, psychologist, psychiatrist, Portuguese origin, worked in Indiana for a long time. I think he is at University of Southern California in Los Angeles, USC. It's also known as University of Spoiled Children, if you are from Stanford. But that's a joke. And if my colleagues at USC hears me saying that, they'll punish me. And he's quite old, retired. I think he keeps writing this popular book. But the point of Damasio was to show experimentally that the dichotomy just doesn't make any sense. What we call rationality, to the extent that it's definable, which we doubt, and it's definable to the ability of computing and calculating action consequences in a coherent way, right? So that it looks like there is a set of axioms and you just make deduction, per se is purely instrumental to motivation. And once you take away motivation and the view of the world and the preferences, in fact, for action and the passion that they induce, being very rational and able to calculate leads you nowhere. In fact, it makes you become irrational because you lose psychological and emotional stability. Your preferences start jumping all over. And so the dichotomy just doesn't make any sense. Again, this is not foundation, but a course of foundation for curious, good student implies that you have also to say, look, if you're interested in this, this gets a lot more interesting than what I can say in class. All right. So that's something that I think was clear in economic theory. And if you like reading, there is a classical book that many people now cite. It used to be forgotten. Adam Smith is famous for The Wealth of Nations. But in fact, if you want to get a good idea of Adam Smith and don't get bored by The Wealth of Nations is a horrible book. Let me tell you. It's a horrible book with some wonderful paragraphs. Okay? It's really a disconcerting book. It's gigantic, and about 90% of it is about bullshit. Oh, I mean, the bullshit he cares. It was very descriptive. And he wanted to tell you everything he had seen and whatever was happening in Glasgow and not in Glasgow, in London and Manchester and whatever he had been or he had heard of. Okay? And so pages and pages and pages and pages of market stories that are entertaining at the beginning, but eventually they get bored. And then 5 pages of analytics, totally sharp, very clear. Wonderful. Point is that you don't know where they are at the beginning, right? So you have to read it through, and God, it's a pain. But anyhow, so the Wealth of Nations is worth reading, but as this kind of, the theory of moral sentiment, which is something different, it's shorter. It's also sometimes a bit boring, but I think it contains an interesting thing that every good economist, an interesting approach to what we're doing and the way we see humans as agent, as rational agent, as people say, okay, which should reconcile you more with current evidence. So I recommend those of you that are curious to look at. My way of summarizing it, which is a bit confusing for those that are not familiar with the mathematics, is that You remember the other day, right? I showed you Foundation of Economics of Samuelson and said Samuelson's main contribution in that book is to show that a lot of the theory of the firm and a lot of the theory of the consumer boil down to maximization under constraint. One might say that there was a period in which we thought that the maximization part was the true insight. And I think it was. Let me say that it still is. We'll see in the course of the course what I mean. But clearly, modern research tend to point out that what might be even more relevant than the fact that you try to do your best, that's what maximization means, are the constraints under which you act. And not just the resource constraint, but also the constraint defined by your perception of the world, your model of the world, your ideas about what's feasible and what's not, and obviously your preferences, because the preferences are a constraint in the maximization process. They are the biggest constraint. They define what you want to maximize, which is why I get my 6th gin and tonic at the Zatter around 2 a.m, because in that moment, my preferences are, I want to maximize the degree of happiness of staying with my friends. Okay? And that becomes, now if some strict, serious theorist was listening to me, they would start screaming, Baudrillard, that's heresy, you're confusing the objective function with the constraint, but it's a foundation class, I can say that. I'm being precise. Okay, back to prices. We saw the rewards. Now we have to price it as cost. We're gonna pay something. Whenever there is a price, somebody pays. That's a cost, we call it, right? It cost me, means I pay the price. They're synonymous, the two phrases mean the same. That thing cost me a lot, means I paid a lot, I paid a very high price. So in order to talk about that, we need a numerator. Why? Because we have to start comparing the cost of this and the cost of that, the price of this, the price of that. A numerator is nothing but a unit of measure. I assume most of you are doing courses in economics, so you already know what it is. Okay? Numerator could be euros, dollars, potatoes, anything. Jordan shoes. Doesn't matter. A numerator is essentially anything other than the thing you're selling, or maybe even the thing you're selling or buying, that is used as a unit of measure of what you pay. The general view, and from this point of view, over the whole history of economics, everybody agrees, so there's no debate. That's the proper way of measuring the price in terms of something else. And if something else is the numerator, that is common, it's the common measure for every price, it's better because that allows for comparability. Because if I measure shoes in potatoes, potatoes in tomatoes, tomatoes in gin and tonic in bananas, it's gonna be a nightmare. Instead, if I measure everything in gin and tonics, I'm just drunk and that's it. And it makes life easy. Okay? So that's what a numerator. Numerator means often that the unit of account is the money used in that country. Be careful, it need not be. It's just a practical matter. Given that I have some currency that circulates in this country, I might as well use that as a numerator. 2 birds with 1 stone. But at least from the abstract point of view, even the old guys in 1600 agreed that I might have florins going around in my country and I measured everything in something else. In fact, Cipolla is very nice on this, and also apart from Cipolla, what's the name of the other guy? No, I forgot, sorry. This was not prepared, just came to my mind. There's a beautiful, but anyhow, one is Cipolla for sure, Carlo M. Cipolla. By the way, this, I learned it from a friend, but I have to spread. You know who Carlo M. Cipolla is? Yes, no. Most people don't. So Carlo M. Cipolla is or was, is he dead? Maybe he's dead. Very famous, very good, and very brilliant Italian origin historian, then taught at Berkeley most of the time. and wrote a lot of interesting books. The bulk of the research is about trading and commerce in Mediterranean and Europe in general, between say 14 and 1700, but also wrote about other things, navigation and so on. He's popularly famous for a little booklet that he wrote once when he got very upset with some colleague, and he wrote some little book on idiots, which is has a lot of remarks about stupid people and how dangerous they are and how damaging they are. I forgot the title of the little book. It's one of these. Anyhow, people like to cite it because it's, it's a big intellectual that makes nasty statement. That's kind of cool. Okay. The reason why he has M in the middle, in fact, has to do with the fact that he was a bit of a nasty guy. There was somebody that was called Carlo Maria Cipolla, and he really could not stand. No, sorry. There was, no, I forgot it. So it has to do with the fact that he introduced the M to differentiate himself from this person. I think this person was called Carlo Cipolla without Maria, and he put the M, but the M is just an M. In the United States, you use the middle name initial often, and he wanted to be different from this guy. He put an M, but he's not Carlo Maria, as everybody calls him, including me. He's just Carlo M. Cipolla because he didn't want to be confused with the other person. All right, and he has a beautiful piece in which he describes the circulation of coins and money in the trading of Europe and the Mediterranean, therefore the upper part of Africa and obviously Turkey, what's now Turkey in the Middle East, between 1300 and 1600. And one observation he makes, because it's at that time you could see, is that the numeraire was often something there was not even a money in circulation. It was extremely rare. It was, for example, I forgot the name now, of the main coin issued by the Byzantine Empire when it existed. And because that had acquired a reputation and the other big monies that were going around were all reducible to their unit of measure, that became the unit of measure. So the actual currency that was circulating was the florin or the ducato and so on, but their value was measured in units of this thing that now I don't remember what it was called. So that's an example of a situation which you use a numeraire, which is a currency. It's a currency that doesn't even circulate anymore, but still it's a numeraire because it's common knowledge, and instead you use something else as a currency. Okay, so nominal prices need not be expressed in a numeraire. Nominal prices may be expressed in the local currency. And relative prices are the ratio of two prices expressed in the same numeraire. Because once you express them in the same numeraire, then you get, by simply dividing one by the other, good for good. In the basic teaching of how exchange takes place, they tend to put you in front of a banana and an apple and you trade those. In current life, we don't. And in fact, this is a good observation that many people have made, and they think, I believe incorrectly, this is a big criticism of economics. Many economists, many economic theorists describe trading as if it has the form of barter. Right? I'm sure that when those of you that are taking economic classes were taught about indifference curves and so on, right? She had potatoes, I had tomatoes, we had some liking. I wanted both potatoes and tomatoes. She also wanted both potato and tomatoes. She liked them to a certain extent. I liked to a certain extent. We trade. I give you some, forgot what I had. I give you some tomatoes, you give me some potatoes, and vice versa. And that determines a relative price. People often say, oh, that's an ideological way of describing it because that never happens. People always trade goods for money. True. Almost. But not really that relevant. Why? Because once you take away the veil of money, even if people are irrational, as it's often said, that is, are not informed enough to calculate exactly the value of the money they receive, in a way or another, they tend to think of that money in terms of whatever they can buy with it. So I don't really care that you pay me in dollars or euros and so on. at the end of the day, when I accept those euros and dollars, very seldom it will be because I want to store them away and look at them in the little box. God, I have a lot of green things, right? Typically, I will do a rough, quick calculation and say, you can get 7 gin and tonics with that. Gin and tonics are going to come up awful in this class, okay? And I hope there are no rules against talking about gin and tonics in class that I get suspended for being pushing you into alcoholism, which I don't mean. In fact, please, one rule of life that you all want to follow is the following. Advocate decreasing demand of everything you like. So in particular, I like gin and tonic, and I beg you, don't. Okay? I want the demand for gin and tonic to go to the lowest level possible. And I'm sure you all understand why. Good. All right. So that's the relative price. Then the real price, economists talk often about real price, and you hear people talking about real price. Now, the real price ideally is really the right thing we want to think of, right? Again, when I think of my Jordan, I want to think those Jordan, given that I'm willing to get rid of them and sell them, what's their real value? Where real value means how many of the objects that I now would like to have and purchase can I buy with the money I get from the real Jordan? And there is a whole industry of computing real values. Why? Because it depends from what you put at the denominator, right? The real price of something for a billionaire is very different from the real price of something for a middle-income person, because their two baskets of consumption are completely different and may move very differently. If you look at US inflation, apart from the last, say, year in which, due to the pandemic, COVID, and so on, there has been huge movement in prices and in unusual direction, for many years, we observed the following. Total inflation, as measured by the CPI, was steady and small. But when you broke down the CPI and you look at prices of certain services versus other, and you particularly look at the basket of goods and services bought by people upper income and the people lower income, you would see very different patterns of inflation. The inflation for, how can I say, the expensive goods of the middle upper class was much higher than the inflation for the cheaper good of the lower class. So if the average inflation was, say, 2%, you would observe that the basket of goods typically bought by people with income below 70,000, in the United States, that's a relatively small number for a household, truly, was going at 1%, it is 0.9, and the basket of goods typically bought by a family in the 200, 300, 400 was going at 3% or 4%. Okay, so it's computing what the real price is. This is just to say it's complicated, and so always be very careful when somebody shows up and says, "Oh, the real let me check the index." Okay, that's why sometimes I prefer using nominal value. At least they're more transparent. All right, said that on the definition. I'm afraid today I'm going to run out of time. That's too bad, but c'est la vie. Let's consider price as a cost. And then we have 4 situations possible. First of all, price as a cost matter mostly for the seller, right? The seller knows the cost, or at least as a perception of the cost. Even if, as my example of the Jordan shows, cost here may have a very confused meaning. It may include sentimental components that eventually you give it a monetary value, but you don't have, written down in your notebook. Feeling sorry, $30. Feeling sorry, very sorry, $50. Feeling happy, minus $30. No, it doesn't work that way. So at least I don't have that note. But let's take a more general case in which something is devoid of emotional value completely, very neutral, right? It's, I don't know, this for Google, and therefore it has a cost. You can have those 3 situations. What do you think the first one implies? When something, and remember what I mean here with price. What happens when price is below cost? Come on.
When you are in an emergency situation,
Could be that I'm forced to sell because I need the cash and the situation is one of emergency. So it's a rare event, but it may happen. The thing costed me such and such. You know, classical economists like the paradox of diamond and water. I'm sure you heard of it, right? I'm really dying of thirst, even if the diamond is worth a lot, meaning it costed me a lot. And what? How do we do that?
demand is lower than supply.
That could be the cause.
Yes.
I'm just trying to figure out what people do. Why I would observe trading taking place at a price below cost. This situation says the person that produced this thing or acquired this thing, in this case, I was saying the diamond, has a certain cost, $1 million, but they are in emergency. They need the other thing desperately, or they need the cash desperately. I use the water, could be the cash. And then they accept a price lower than the cost. Well,
something is going to happen to this, and others need to sell that as soon as possible.
yeah, let's say in case of I need to sell my diamond in exchange of water. You understand? It's a sell. I sell the diamond and I get a bottle of water because I'm dying.
Or maybe I have some cookies, and I know they will not be good tomorrow.
They may be rotten. Everybody has observed that. But there, even we don't know yet if it is below cost. So, this may become very complicated analysis because we'll have to figure out. For example, take the case of vegetables or go to Rialto, the fish market. The price of fish sometimes goes down during the day. It's old enough. They see no reason. Tomorrow it may be rotten, goes down. It's unclear if that's a case of price below cost or just price going down because I still have stuff left over. But I wanted to point you, and we're done, though, but let's finish there, that in general, if I observe people trading at a price below what they think the cost is, of the two things, one, either the cost is computed subjectively and doesn't have a monetary component, right? Like with my Jordan shoes, no matter how much I sell them, I would always say, oh, you got a good deal. You have no idea how much this cost me emotionally, right? Or if the cost is actually reflected in actual outlays, I will see progressively people exiting from supplying that good, if this is repeated over time. So we can certainly think of a lot of particular circumstances, special cases in which people trade at price below cost, but they're special. And we tend to explain them with subjective particular situation. If it is repeated over time, we tend to think that supply will disappear. In the opposite case, and again, when it's regular and not special, what is it we will observe? That when something trades at a price much higher than the cost or higher than the cost, more people will try to supply it, or less people will try to demand it. These considerations seem to suggest that in the long run, here I'm going to the classical economists, we should see prices equal to cost. I say, Boldrin, this is not very original. I agree. But I'm trying to convince you that that statement makes sense only under very, very, very special circumstances. And in general, as a statement, as an economic statement, it's actually bullshit. But that's something that we have learned over time, and it's a bit delicate, but I think it's important. So the common sense says when prices are below cost, either more people purchase the thing, demand goes up, then price goes up, or more people fewer people offer the thing, so then, they disappear from the market and the price goes up. With vice versa in the opposite situation. So common sense suggests that price should equal cost in normal circumstances without extraordinary things happening and when things are repeated over time. This was the view of classical economics all the way until the end of the 19th century. So for 250 years, people thought that this was a very reasonable anchor point. In some sense, it still is, but in order for it to be, it requires so many special circumstances that it's not very relevant. In particular, it's not true for this one. It's not true for this one. In fact, it's not true for anything I see in this room. But we'll talk about that too. Okay? 7 o'clock. 7:01. Bye.